Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Hermes, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Plenary on Policy and Climate Governance. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. Furthermore, the chat box is available in case you have any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me for technical assistance. Japanese language simultaneous interpretation is available during this session. The feature has already been activated and is available now. To listen in Japanese language, please click the interpretation button in the menu at the bottom of your screen and select Japanese. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You are at the session titled Plenary on Policy and Climate Governance. We are ready to get started, so I will now pass the floor to Veronica Pedrosa, journalist and columnist. Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Hermes, and hello and welcome to everybody joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here for the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. This year, of course, unusually online. Nevertheless, it's great that we're able to meet and deal with this very urgent issue. This unusual year of the pandemic that we've just had has brought together so many issues in our lives, hasn't it? We can see how climate change interact with global warming, with public health, with biodiversity. And that's why a forum like this, I think, is incredibly urgent to go ahead as planned. As you've heard earlier, our theme is Enabling Resilience for All, the official decade to scale up action, resilience to unifying theme, and discussions organized around 5 enablers. Today, it's climate governance and policy. It's going to be introduced through a plenary session in which experts will frame the key issues with the aim to deepen understanding on how each enabler is currently supporting efforts of building the resilience of society, economic sectors, nature, and local communities against the adverse impacts of climate change, where trade-offs may occur, and how to minimize and avoid them, and how to scale up good examples and practices to support resilience for all. These sessions will also explore interlinkages among the 5 enablers and how they can support building resilience in a holistic manner. So very proud to be able to set the tone in a way with this first plenary session dealing with this first enabler. And we're going to begin with a keynote speech from Lauren Regarda, who is Deputy Speaker of and Antique Congresswoman from the Philippines. She actually used to be my boss. We used to work together in the Philippines, both as journalists, a long time ago, but since then, Lauren has become a champion for climate change and disaster resilience in the Asia Pacific. Thank you, Lauren. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Veronica, and what a great reunion in this Climate Adaptation Forum. I hope to see you and your family in person sometime soon, post-pandemic. And I welcome all our participants in this Adaptation Summit, something so urgent, especially as we recover from COVID-19. And I've always said that the recovery of COVID-19 must be attuned to the climate pathway. So good day to all our colleagues in this plenary session on policy and climate governance for the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. The massive scale of the climate crisis has never been more evident than today. We meet today in recognition of a planet that is fast declining, as record highs of 2020 as the warmest year and the period 2011 to 2020 as the warmest decade on record, worsening effects of climate change and the economic shocks from this pandemic has set us back to achieve our goals on sustainable and resilient development. Our planet has been ailing for more than a century and a half, which started when we began to burn fossil fuels that released harmful greenhouse gas emissions. This has brought about extreme weather events, increasing temperatures, and rising sea level. And this trend is set to continue and intensify due to the increasing heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Our region, aside from being considered as the most disaster-prone region, is also considered extremely vulnerable to adverse weather events and climate impacts. The Asian Development Bank study called A Region at Risk: The Human Dimensions of Climate Change in Asia and the Pacific stated that, and I quote, even under the Paris Agreement consensus scenario in which global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, some of the land area, our ecosystems, and socio-economic sectors will be significantly affected by climate change impacts to which policymakers and the investment community need to adapt to, unquote. We could expect the deterioration of the Asian water towers, prolonged heat waves, coastal sea level rise, changes in rainfall patterns, which could disrupt ecosystem services and lead to severe effects on livelihoods and in turn affect human health and migration dynamics and give rise to potential conflicts. The 2019 Asia Pacific Disaster Report also pointed out that the inclusion of slow onset hazard has, for the first time, shown the full extent of disaster risk in our region. It noted that, and I quote, economic losses due to disasters are larger than previously estimated, with most of this additional loss linked to the impact of slow onset disasters in the agricultural sector, and that multi-hazard average annual loss for the region is 675 billion US dollars, of which 405 billion dollars or 60% is drought-related agricultural losses, particularly in rural economies, unquote. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, our people's health, our well-being, livelihoods have been severely affected. We are also seeing the worst economic performance across countries since World War II, with the Asia Pacific region as a whole expected to grow by only 0.9% in 2020, the lowest rate since 1967. We therefore need greater solidarity, cooperation, action in enhancing the resilience within our region in light of the intensifying effects of the climate crisis and the crippling effects of this pandemic to our local economies. In the Philippines, we already have laws in place. We have laws that have laid the policy landscape for managing climate risk and protecting the environment so that the nation will survive and thrive in the present era of the climate crisis. But beyond the four walls of the legislature, of which I've been part of since 1998, strong political will and commitment are needed to deliver and breathe life to these laws and policies. We have just a few: the Clean Air Act for reducing pollution, the Renewable Energy Law for promoting clean, sustainable, renewable energy, Climate Change Act, which created the Climate Change Commission to strengthen climate governance, the People's Survival Fund for local adaptation funding, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act to build resilience against disasters, the expanded NEPA's National Integrated Protected Area System that declares more than 90 protected areas all over the country to ensure ecosystems integrity, the Environment Education Awareness Act for inculcating love for nature among the youth in the education sector, even the Dream Jobs Act for fostering a just transition towards a green economy. We have the Clean Water Act as well, and the Ecological Solid Waste Management Law. So many policies. With our call for government agencies and local government units to effectively implement environmental, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and disaster risk reduction measures, we also make full use of our oversight and legislative functions to steer our communities away from the dire threats of continuing disasters. National policies, plans, and programs must translate into local action with measurable gains through fair and effective enforcement. As a member of the board of the Global Commission on Adaptation, I wish to echo what has been defined as the adaptation triple dividend. That with the proper adaptation interventions, we can avert future losses, spur economic gains through innovation, deliver social and environmental benefits to everyone, but particularly to those currently affected and most at risk. In the GCA's flagship Adapt Now report, adaptation investments were found to consistently deliver high returns with benefit cost ratios ranging from 2 is to 1 to 10 is to 1. Adaptation often creates more jobs per dollar spent than traditional investment with superior local benefits. That is why we must not waver from our call, also made at the Climate Adaptation Summit just last January, for governments and businesses to commit to bring climate finance to 50% adaptation, for being skewed in favor of mitigation, and to address the problem that thus far only 10% of climate finance actually reaches local communities. So that's the challenge, for it to trickle down to local communities and to scale up the bias for locally led adaptation. We saw the urgent need to promote the principles of locally led adaptation in local communities, in vulnerable communities. And I feel that in the Philippines, I'm representing a province which is mountains and coastal with indigenous peoples as well. So we see frontline, vulnerable populations. They must have a voice and a role in shaping the recovery in every sector and system. The response must address underlying inequities in society and give influence, aid, agency to local actors on the front lines of climate change, including marginalized communities, indigenous peoples, women and children, today's Women's Day, and our youth. Local planning and action and investments in the existing social capital of communities can help ensure that the best information is shared, resources are made available, and the best policies are actually enacted, implemented, utilized, and hopefully the gains are measured. We must expand financial resources available to local governments, community-based organizations, and other local actors to help create multi-stakeholder support with greater influence on evidence-based decision-making, especially at the local level, where we can best identify, prioritize, implement, and monitor climate adaptation solutions. We must facilitate efficient access to international and domestic climate finance and the transfer of technology and knowledge on adaptation and mitigation pursuant to the provisions of the Paris Agreement and in accordance with the principle of climate justice. Considering that ecosystems contribute at least 30% of climate solutions, mainstreaming biodiversity conservation and nature-based solutions should be at the very heart of our discourse, planning and implementation of climate action with cross-sectoral, cross-pillar, and multi-stakeholder engagement as its foundation. We must widely adopt nature-based adaptation solutions, such as wetlands restoration for water storage and soil moisture, reconnecting the rivers to the floodplains, planting mangroves to protect from coastal flooding, increasing our green urban spaces, nature-based solutions. They offer the great potential to reduce risks from multiple hazards and to yield jobs and to improve livelihoods while protecting our biodiversity. We must also invest in social preparation for the transformation of all sectors towards low carbon development and a green, sustainable, resilient economy, and the sustained implementation and monitoring of the outcomes of our national climate change action plans. We need to unite behind science as a way to inform our actions and our policies, most especially for our vulnerable populations in the region and on the ground. We need to make science work for us. We need to make it available and understandable and actionable to our communities. We need to identify the specific risks and the vulnerabilities in our region and to work together in addressing these challenges. And we need to bolster the call for limiting the average global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius because hard-fought development gains and the productivity of all will continue to be undermined or even reversed if the 1.5 degrees limit of the Paris Agreement is breached. This year, until 2030, declared by the United Nations as a decade on ecosystems restoration, we need rapid action to combat planetary threats, to safeguard our ecosystems, which are the basis of all business, all livelihood, even health, wellness, and even happiness. At the end of this decade, by 2030, it's also the deadline of the Sustainable Development Goals and will mark the closing of the window of opportunity to deflect the catastrophic effects of climate change. So, as leaders, as policymakers, as planners, as implementers, as champions, as workers in our respective fields, let us give our region and the world the best fighting chance to bounce back better from this pandemic, ready and braced to cope with and to overcome this climate crisis. And through this summit and beyond, let us learn from another, support each other's adaptation and mitigation actions, advise each other on strategies, and strike convergence where possible. The Philippines looks forward and stands ready for more meaningful regional partnerships and initiatives that we could scale up at the global level. Our region, being a climate vulnerable and disaster prone region, has the insight and the resolve to truly enable a lasting and genuine resilience for all and the world. It was my privilege to have addressed you today in this virtual adaptation summit and look forward to learning and listening to our leaders who will speak after me. Thank you so much to the APAN, UNEP, and to Veronica, a dear friend.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been great to see you, and thank you for making the time in your very busy schedule. I know that you're running off back to Congress now and have to leave our summit, our conference, but we are very grateful indeed for that fine setting up of the day's themes as we talk about policy and climate governance. Next, we have an artistic performance by Grupo Jobel, Art for Earth. It's an international cultural organization that has committed to raising awareness and engagement about social and environmental issues through artistic and educational programs since 2000. Let's take a look. Once again, that was Grupo Jodel with their performance Resilient Drop. Let's get on now and deal with the substance of our meeting, policy and climate governance. We want to put across several key messages here about how climate governance encompasses global, national, and local dimensions, about how countries at the global and national level begin enacting novel legal frameworks, strengthening and or creating new institutions, and adopting new policies and plans. But a shift is necessary from forming a climate governance system to a functioning climate governance system, which allows institutions to work at the level. Climate change impacts are already being felt, as you heard in that speech from Lauren Nagada. Local communities are at the very front line of victims. The voices of women and marginalized communities are often unheard and excluded from climate governance at almost all levels. The resilience of human and social systems cannot be built, though, without an inclusive governance system in place. We have four very expert panelists for you to hear from this morning. Dr. Sunita Rajakumar is our first speaker. She founded the country chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative in May 2019. The Malaysian chapter was the second in the world and to date still the only chapter in Asia, the country chapter in Asia. It has been a steep learning curve for her, she admits it, but as a professional director on boards of businesses, she's realizing that directors are responsible as long-term stewards of the organization to manage climate risk and to build the resilience of businesses. Now, Sunita, we want to talk about examples in this session to start off with. What can you talk about?
Thank you so much. And happy International Women's Day to you. And of course, our panelists as well. So Climate Governance Malaysia advocates climate governance initiative principles because we recognize that to govern climate risks and opportunities effectively, boards need to be equipped with the right tools to make the best possible decisions, because we are calling for responsive and responsible leadership in businesses and for purposeful stewardship from the most prominent custodians and long-term stewards of corporations, which are the board of directors. And this is especially important because we see that the overwhelming majority of scientists, influential economists, governments around the world, investors, regulators, other stakeholders are already challenging companies to demonstrate an integrated strategic approach to addressing risks and opportunities. So these need to be addressed as part of the duty of boards of directors. So within that context, climate governance within businesses, many of which are directly and indirectly responsible for the majority of emissions, this can increase climate resilience. So we are mindful that no governance structure alone will ever control climate change, but a holistic corporate governance architecture will certainly enable a much easier systemic approach. And so the World Economic Forum's climate governance principles are designed for that. And we believe that when properly implemented, climate governance will play a crucial role in the planning and financing of adaptation actions as the response mechanisms are embedded throughout the organization. So in Malaysia, CGM has achieved many milestones. The first non-executive director initiative, we have organized for and convened over 50 events, attracted almost 1,000 subscribers to our regular newsletters with an open rate of 50%. We are gaining a reputation for thoughtful and insightful content curation. And we've attracted many partners who want to work with us, including the regulators and industry bodies, such as the Malaysian Institute of Corporate Governance, the Minority Shareholder Watch Group. Now, aside from the regular series of webinars, we're also hosting and partnering in multiple events in the upcoming Global Summit on Climate Governance, which is happening in a few weeks' time. And all the webinars are free, so please sign up for this. We have a speaker lineup, which is great, including Al Gore, Nigel Topping, Mark Tucker, the chairman of HSBC, Punit Renjan, the global CEO for Deloitte. We are also launching a series of roundtable engagements with the government to discuss policies which could be implemented in the event of increased national climate ambition. There needs to be a high degree of confidence in stated national ambition and the involvement of private sector or industries with a sound understanding of public sentiment to solve these issues, whether in the ideation, financing, or implementation stages. And so there's therefore an urgent need for an alignment of government policy between the three key priorities: economic, climate, and energy priorities. And this will happen against a backdrop of socio-economic well-being of citizens. Because we believe that when government policy is explicit and relatively predictable, we can then rely on the private sector to galvanize, to act, to enable a smooth transition for businesses and for the public, whether it's the price of carbon or regulation on internal combustion engines or hydrogen fuel and so on and so forth. This is especially important if you believe in a pioneering concept of inevitable policy response. So in all, I would rephrase that climate governance just doesn't have a supportive role in the planning and financing of adaptation actions. It is crucial for effective and impactful planning and financing of adaptation actions. Thank you, Veronica.
Thanks very much indeed. Sunita, of course, we'll come back to you to hear more about your recommendations a little bit later. But let's hear from our next distinguished panelist. Saida Rizwana Hassan is an enrolled lawyer with the Supreme Court of Bangladesh. Her main focus is to promote the notion of environmental justice in Bangladesh. She is working for the cause of environment as a chief executive of a reputed national NGO, Bella, since 1993. Now, Rizwana, equity and inclusion are well-established principles in global climate policy, building on that foundation in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and related instruments. Inclusion is at the core of the SDGs as well. There's that objective of leaving no one behind. But what have you found in your work?
Thank you very much. Well, I think I have found it to be very different in practical life. I see many movements being developed here in Bangladesh just to oppose what is being imposed on them, on communities, in the name of development. So I see that people's voice, instead of finding a definite place in the development agenda, is attempted to be subdued. And that's why people are coming together, organizing themselves and raising their voices in the form of movement. So yes, you have these things not only in the international documents or in the climate documents, you have these things in our national domestic constitutions also. But having it in law and having it in practice are essentially two different things.
Can you speak to anything specific that you found? Because Bangladesh, as I know most people are aware of the situation there, where you have very low-lying delta areas.
See, if climate change takes place the way it is being predicted, the way it's being feared, then the way we draw our map will have to be changed. 1/3 of our landmass is just 1 meter above sea level. So if sea level rises by 1 meter or above, this 1/3 will go under the sea. And Bangladesh remains the 8th most populated country of the world. If that happens, 1/3 of it goes under the ocean, then we will have to deal with this 1/3 population within this land that will be remaining, which means that Bangladesh will become the most populous country of the world. Our capital is already the most populated capital of the world. It has a staggering population of 47,000 something per square kilometer. The sweetwater fishery that we have extensive network of rivers, transboundary rivers. If ocean moves up, if the sea moves up, then the saline water will actually be getting into the freshwater reserves, which means that the second largest sweetwater fishery of the world, we are the second largest sweetwater fishery of the world, will all be destroyed. We'll not have enough water to drink, we'll not have suitable water to use for our irrigation purposes, and we'll lose that second largest sweetwater fishery. The largest mangrove of Bangladesh will also be lost. It's not the largest mangrove of Bangladesh, it is the largest mangrove of the world. So we have many challenges ahead of us. We already have our existing environmental challenges, and the performance of Bangladesh in terms of environmental management is very poor. Usually we rank 179 out of 180 countries. Last year, for some reason, our position was 164, but general management of environment is actually not at all satisfactory. And if coupled with that, we get this problem of climate justice, which is not a creation of our own, then the entire environmental management system will have major hiccups, and we'll have to adapt to a very large scale.
In other words, what you're saying is that resilience simply doesn't exist without inclusivity?
Absolutely. Sometimes I feel that resilience is actually not a very positive term, because you keep on emitting and you expect us to be resilient. You don't change your development focuses. You pursue a faulty path of development which is destroying the natural resource bases, and you expect poor communities to be resilient and to be coming up with solutions to deal with the crisis is perhaps not a fair prescription. That is something I don't consider as justice.
I think there are people in the Philippines who might agree with you. I remember covering the aftermath of that big typhoon Yolanda, and there was a big, huge ship that was swept up right into land, well into land, and someone had graffitied on the side, climate justice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
We'll come back to you in a little bit, but I do want to bring in our next speaker. Dr. Batjar Galzamba is serving as the Special Envoy of Mongolia on Climate Change and National Focal Point of Mongolia for the UNFCCC, covering as well the coordination of activities related to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and GCF. He was the Minister of Environment of Mongolia from 1980 to 1995 and has a distinguished biography, which you can see for yourselves on the website. It's great to have you here. Dr. Batjargal. Mongolia is a completely different kind of terrain from either Malaysia or Bangladesh, from where we've heard our first two speakers. And also you have much more of a government background. From your perspective, how are we doing when it comes to policy and governance?
Thank you, Veronica, for your kind introduction. And today in Mongolia is holiday because of International Women's Day. And my congratulations to all ladies who are participating in today's event. And in respect of your questions about governance, my understanding is that the climate governance architecture mostly covered policy instruments and institutional arrangements. I would like to say a few words about the policy instruments in Mongolia. The government of Mongolia has developed first national climate program around 20 years ago. And the Parliament of Mongolia approved first national climate program in 2001. And after 10 years of its implementation, this program was updated in 2011. And after that, government has developed more comprehensive document called as a Green Development Policy, which was approved by the Parliament in 2014. Some key issues on climate change were reflected in this new document devoted to green development. And in 2015, just before UNFCCC COP in Paris, we have developed NDC with some modest GHG reduction target and included certain adaptation measures. And in 2016, the Parliament approved National Sustainable Development Vision 2030 in line with international SDGs. In 2016, the Parliament ratified the Paris Agreement and government decided to upgrade NDC with more ambitious GHG reduction target. Actually, we have developed a new document called as NDC, which was adopted by the government in November 2019. And we submitted this document to the Convention Secretary in 2020. NDC also included section for adaptation, but honestly said, it was much weaker than mitigation part of the document due to limited gap assessments and some costing exercise and so on.
Mm.
Currently, we are implementing GSEP supported National Adaptation Plan project jointly with UNEP. And we hope the outcome of this project would be greatly contribute to the improvement of adaptation planning.
So, Dr. Batjargal, may I ask you, what is your observation and assessment of how Mongolia is doing? Are there specific cases that give you hope or make you despair?
But just I can say that we have enough policy document on paper currently, and also some institutional arrangements. But now we have to act. But as you know, for almost every country, big challenges related to finance, related to manpower, human capacity, and also technology issues and so on. And Mongolia is a small country in terms of size of population, but lifestyle and livelihood is quite different, as you mentioned it, in comparison with Bangladesh or the countries and so on. And just maybe I can highlight some examples as a second round of question, which can be the interesting for other region in Asia Pacific. And
yes, when we when we do the second round, we're going to talk about key recommendations. We had been hoping for Muhammad Irfan Tariq from Pakistan to join us, but apparently the internet is not working that well from where he is right now. We are working on getting him back. But for now, if I may, what I'd like to do is to go round again and go back to Datin Sunita Raja Kumal and ask her about her ideas for recommendations going forward from her particular perspective.
Thank you, Veronica. So the private sector, industry, businesses need to make certain judgments around the climate crisis, whether it's going to end up being positioned on the right or wrong side of climate history, whether there's value being created or destroyed in this transition, what kind of disclosure is needed, what are the technology breakthroughs which are needed, the roles and opportunities of nature and biodiversity protection. We need to do stress testing. There's long conversations with investors and the public about how well industry is positioned. Do we need to consider more than zero plans and specific emissions reductions objectives? What is the implied temperature warming of our assets or our portfolios? And as we saw in the very powerful and moving presentation by Isa Bharti just earlier, what is the intergenerational equity in terms of drawdown of financial and nature reserves? And in particular, employees and customers are very interested in this. So one important message I would like to leave with the listener today is that unless numbers are aligned to Paris, behaviors will not be aligned. And it's not just Paris, is it? The key insight that we know today scientifically is that whether or not we will succeed in delivering Paris is no longer about just decarbonizing the world's energy system. The previous speaker from UNEP referred to the triple crisis of climate, biodiversity, and pollution. And so we know it is equally important to maintain our biodiversity, maintain the carbon sinks in natural ecosystems, and transform the world's food system. So caretakers and stewards of the business organizations, such as boards of directors, as well as allocators of capital, such as bankers, investors, other financiers, they will not be able to argue, Veronica, that they did not realize climate risks were not hugely material. We are already seeing that recognition of these risks, as well as allocators of, as well as how the accounts are being drawn up. The decarbonization transition, which the world has committed to implement, is already rewiring our economic DNA, and it is hard to see how any sector is going to be untouched. To give a sense of what's needed in terms of an incentive that would get us to that 1.5 degree warmer world, we're looking at something in the horizon of between 75 to 100 US dollars per metric ton of carbon, that sort of pricing. And while some businesses are already using this in their internal shadow pricing, and there's going to be a lot of policies, regulations, other things that can help, but the reality is we are a long way from where the carbon price needs to be in order to get us there. A number of companies, of course, are committing to be net zero in terms of their direct emissions, in terms of emissions from the power they are using, and in terms of emissions produced in their supply chain, what is also known as scope 1, 2, and 3. So this will disproportionately and adversely affect businesses which are not ready for this pivot.
Sunita, can I ask you?
Yes.
You know, one of the goals of this conversation that we're having over this week is to feed into COP26.
Yes.
We want to have, if there is one thing that you think the people that you work with in your network, private sector in Malaysia. I don't know which specific companies, you might want to name a few. What do you think they would want COP26 to bear in mind?
Well, I think that all around the world, businesses are already stepping up. International accounting standards are being drawn up. The way sustainability indicators are being measured is also quite transparent, mainly the TCFD and SASB frameworks. So ultimately, we recognize that the consequences are going to be simultaneously uncertain and yet totally predictable. You know, there are hidden risks. The transition is going to be messy, but the transparency and the disclosure today means that capital is going to be deployed to where it needs to go. And this is going to increase our chances of a smoother transition. This transition, Veronica, must be the most significant in economic history. And if 20 years ago, we thought that the likelihood for catastrophic change was potentially at 5 or 6 degrees of warming, we now know that it is at 2 degrees of warming. So we have true reason to start considering declaring a state of planetary emergency now. So this is the key message and the recommendation. There is an urgent need to action in implementing climate governance throughout the organization to scale up adaptation actions and therefore build climate resilience.
Thank you very much indeed, Datin Sunita Rajakumar. Before I move on to the recommendations that I'm going to ask from Razwana, I wanted to bring in Director General of Climate Change Department of Pakistan, Mohammed Irfan Tariq. We've managed to get him back on the line. Thank you very much indeed. Irfan, it's great to have you here. I hope the technology stays with us. Can I ask you, because we don't have that much time, just to briefly tell us about what your assessment is of climate governance and policy, bright spots and hot spots in Pakistan? I'm hoping that Irfan can hear us.
Okay, मैं करता हूँ. Yes, I can hear you. Sorry.
That's all right. It's great to have you here. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I can hear you. I can see you. Hopefully, you can see me and hear me. May I request you to please repeat the question, because the internet connection here is a bit not reliable. And if you allow, I would switch off the camera so that I can hear you and you can hear me well. Yeah?
Yes, that's okay. The important thing is to hear about Pakistan's situation when it comes to climate change governance and policy. We want to know about your assessment of the situation there, about what's needed, and what have been the pluses, the bright spots in enabling resilience.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question, and allow me to answer this question in the current context of COVID. And as you see, COVID has stalled the whole world, and businesses and communities, they are in a state of lockdown. So considering this situation, and as you all know, the COP last year was postponed, and along with the subsidiary bodies. But what we did in Pakistan, we actually learned from this situation, and the good learning we have is that when you tackle nature in an inappropriate way, the nature actually flashes back. COVID-19 is also something which do not a carrier of zoonotic disease. So the learning for us was to actually engage nature-based solutions into our climate agenda. So in Pakistan, what we did was we were lucky to draw up a very robust climate agenda with a very focused approach towards nature-based solutions. And I won't go into details, but I would like to share with the community the initiative we took. So the number one, 10 of this project, it's a globally recognized project for consider forestation.
Oh dear, it doesn't sound like that line is holding for us to Mohammed Irfan Tariq in Pakistan. I'm not even sure where he is, if he's in which city he's in at the moment. I think we're going to have to let go of that line and try to just move on to get some more feedback from our other participants. Rizwana, if you're with us, I wonder if you could make your recommendations from, the front line of working for climate justice going forward that would feed into COP26.
Yeah. I think it's very important that we understand that climate change is a crisis that has not been created by one particular state. It is a phenomenon that has been created by the developed countries, so they have to take the responsibility more. And I think it is, when we talk about climate governance, we talk about changes in governance, reforms in governance, transformation in governance at global level, at regional level, at national level, and at local level. I think it's important that we change the paradigm of development. If we continue to fund the fossil fuel industry and then ask for climate change, that will be real contradiction in terms. We are in a state where science has proved it beyond doubt that climate is changing, and it's changing for worse for many of us. So I think it has to be taken as a global responsibility. We must change our patterns of development, rethink our patterns of development in all tiers, and must move away from false solution and make, really propagate for a less consumptive globe. Our societies are really going for overconsumption. I think it's important that at the regional level, we really work together to protect the shared natural resources that we have, so that our natural resource bases are not depleted. And when we are faced with the crisis, we can go for a nature-based solution. At the national level, growth first and environment later, that psyche has to be scrapped. We have to first protect nature and then think about development. And I think we cannot go for reaching climate justice without ensuring that we empower the local government agencies and the communities so that they can talk about their crisis and the solutions they want, and we design the adaptation strategies keeping in mind whatever recommendations are coming from the grassroots level. It should not be a top-down approach, it should be a bottom-up approach, and it should not be anthropocentric, it should be nature-centric.
Thank you very much indeed. Very tight recommendations there. I'm sure that COP26 will be listening. Thank you. Now let's move on to Mongolia. Dr. Bhatjargal, you said that you had some ideas already about recommendations going forward. What are they? I think you need to unmute your microphone, Doctor.
Sorry. Yes, of course. And I have 3 small messages as an example from Mongolian endeavors. The first one is, of course, if we want to develop local community lead adaptation plan, we have to educate the local community. And we are organizing the on-site workshops and seminars, and inviting representatives of local communities and also local government officials and civil society organizations. and to have more broad understanding about modern trend of climate change, not only in a global scale, but also in regional scale, and even with some local, in terms of local patterns of climate change and so on. Another big issue is that we are bringing the professionals from central institutions who are working on the climate change policy and so on, to bring local area, to introduce local circumstances, and not only just physical environment like landscape and so on, but also traditional way of life. In Mongolia, we, as you know, the local community, which is practicing pastoralism for hundreds of years, accumulated some experience, cope with climate weather hazards, and some their inherent adaptive capacity can be used to cope with some climate variabilities as well. And it means we can save some expenditure for adaptation exercise using already inherited capacity for local communities and so on. And third message is that we also are trying to use more local community knowledge, but also to bring modern science advancement. For example, recently we developed Green Development Action Plan for one of 21 provinces of Mongolia, and using the remote sensing data and so-called system dynamic modeling and so on.
Okay.
And it was very interesting for local communities, because before they when develop some plan, they usually use like a wish list, asking
Wish list.
and so on.
Yeah.
But now, when we use some system dynamic model, we can have many options, even
Okay.
some alternative way how we can the huge more transformative change because of precipitation shift and quite different situation with expected climate change and so on. And therefore, if we can combine the traditional way of life and indigenous knowledge and the modern technology and very the whole arranged institution structure and so on, somehow we can cope with expected climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Bachargal. It's been a real pleasure to moderate and to host this panel discussion with Datin Sunita Rajakumar, Saida Rizwana Hassan, and Dr. Bachargal Zamba, and that brief star appearance from Irfan in Pakistan. We've had such an enormous range of perspectives. And I've been really impressed with the linkages that have been made from very sort of sub-national, local grassroots level, right up to the top, and these big international policies that are being made. And I think that is just so appropriate in this year in which, as many of our speakers have said, COVID-19 has demonstrated once again the way, how tightly entangled climate change is with pollution, with public health. And these are matters of life and death for people all around the world. At the very front line, though, the victims are very much in our area of the world, in the Asia Pacific, and among the poorest and the marginalized. So inclusivity is not an option, it is a must if we are to be resilient going forward. Thank you so much for those strong messages. Now, I think we're going to take a break as we go ahead with this 7th Asia Pacific Climate Adaptation Conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Veronica. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the technical sessions beginning at 2 p.m. Bangkok time, followed immediately by highlights of the day one and a special International Women's Day commemoration event hosted by the Embassy of Italy to the Kingdom of Thailand. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Hubelo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. We highly encourage you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN2020. Thank you once again for your participation and see you in the next sessions.